When it comes to horror games, the Resident Evil franchise by the AAA game developer Capcom is a staple. It is the pioneer of the survival horror genre, a subgenre of action and horror games that focuses more on the player character's survival rather than fighting and killing enemies. Many video games after the first Resident Evil games would soon adopt this genre, one of them being Konami's renowned Silent Hill franchise, which would later become the most influential franchise of the genre. The Resident Evil franchise only had a trilogy back in the 90s, the first game and two sequels. Capcom made a remaster of the first game for the GameCube, and there was news that a new title would be released for the PlayStation 2, but it turns out to be an entirely different video game. But it seems to only be a minor setback, as after the fourth game was released in 2005 for the GameCube, the franchise has become consistent in releasing new titles every 2 to 3 years. But it seems to have come with a price, as starting with the fourth game, Resident Evil seemed to have abandoned the very genre that it had pioneered, becoming an action horror game instead with an over-the-shoulder camera perspective and focusing more on killing a bunch of enemies rather than survival, going as far as to making your player character punch a boulder into submission. It's like the success of the Devil May Cry franchise went into the developer's head and decided to make all their games similar to how wacky and over the top that franchise is. Capcom also released a high-definition version of the first game's re-release in the GameCube to all modern platforms in 2015, seemingly setting the tone that Capcom is indeed coming back to do more horror games for the franchise. In 2017, Capcom seems to have finally stopped smoking crack and went back to the survival horror genre. Resident Evil 7 was the first survival horror game in a long time that seems to have nothing to do with the other games, but there was just enough fan service to solidify its connection to the previous mainline games. The fact that it's a first-person survival horror made it draw a lot of comparisons to modern survival horror games, especially with Outlast, with how both games can use stealth to avoid enemy encounters. However, what takes Resident Evil 7 apart from Outlast is that the player can actually use firearms to protect themselves, which made Resident Evil 7 to be considered a return to form for the franchise, as the game focuses more on survival and horror with just the right amount of combat mix in it. 2 years from that, however, definitely marks Capcom's return to Resident Evil's roots. Capcom has definitely outdone themselves with creating this remake. It perfectly encapsulates the horror and visceral gore of the first games to the PlayStation 1 and has stayed true to its original material by emphasizing exploration, survival, and puzzle solving rather than mindless action. It is a modernized presentation of the old era of the franchise. So, ladies and gentlemen, join me as we explore this fantastic remake of Resident Evil 2. Resident Evil 2 Remake was supposedly planned ever since the release of the first game's remake for the GameCube, but the series creator didn't want to divert from the development of the fourth game, so it was put on indefinite hold. It was only until 2015 when Capcom announced that they were working on the remake, after the director of the original game had pushed Capcom to make a remake for years. The remake was finally released in 2019, now using Capcom's own RE engine, the same engine used by Resident Evil 7, which allowed the team to recreate Resident Evil 2 to meet modern expectations. The story of the remake is mostly similar to the original, with some changes concerning the intro sequences and the meeting of the two protagonists. For those of you that are new to the Resident Evil franchise and have not yet tried this remake, the basic premise is that there's some sort of virus in the fictional Raccoon City that's turning people into undying, mindless monsters that eat humans. Simply put, a zombie outbreak. Leon and Claire, two strangers that faithfully met amidst this outbreak, traverse Raccoon City with different objectives. And while they do intend to help each other out, they got separated when an oil tanker rammed their car. Now it's up to them to complete their own objectives separately. While Resident Evil 2 is indeed a faithful remake, it retains the over-the-shoulder camera angle that stemmed from Resident Evil 4. However, the game still focuses more on survival and horror rather than combat and action. As with the original game, you have various firearms to collect as well as upgrades for them along the way, which will tremendously help your survival. However, you don't have that much of an ammo for them, so you'll always be making decisions between running away from enemies to save bullets or fighting them head-on to remove some nuances later in the game as you backtrack your way to objectives. Staying faithful to the original material, the remake also presents you with a lot of puzzles in order to make progress. And Capcom did so in a way that doesn't hold the player's hands and guide them to the answer. It's up to you to find out the answers to these puzzles as well as to lock safes and such, as well as where to go next. Which brings this remake so much closer to the original games. The game is of average length. It took me around 25 hours or so to finish the entirety of the campaign. But if you're not a coward like me, you can most likely lessen that playtime since you will spend less time idling around waiting for enemies to pass by or sitting inside a save room to contemplate life and fearing to get back out in the hallways because of the spooky noises and enemies. There's so much more things that I want to say, but I don't want this brief summary to become an essay. And yes, I am aware that the game is already more than 3 years old, but I really like the game, so here I am making a review out of it. So if you haven't played the game yet and liked everything that I've said earlier about the game and considering on buying it, the link to the game's Steam store page will be in the description as always. This game is both for longtime fans and people that are extremely new to the franchise. It has enough elements to keep these two audiences together without alienating either of them. And if you want to know more about the game, then stay for a little longer as we dive deeper. This section will be a lot more informative to people that are longtime fans of the franchise or people that have played the original game but still haven't played this remake and avoided spoilers as much as they could. If you are new to the franchise or if you already know about these changes, this section might still be of interest to you, but you can use the timestamps in the description and in the YouTube playhead to skip to the section you like if you don't want to stay in here. Now, it's been at least a decade since the last time I've played the original Resident Evil 2, but I do have some lingering memories about it that I can use to compare to the remake. But to make a more accurate list of things Capcom changed in the remake, I decided to search the internet for a full list of the changes. I will only include the changes that don't spoil the game, so this section may be fairly short. As mentioned earlier, one of the more noticeable changes are the intro sequences. As you all may remember, Leon and Claire first met in the diner inside Raccoon City itself in the original game. In the remake, however, they met in a gas station outside of the city, though their meeting is still reminiscent of that from the original game.
Don't shoot! Get down!
Wait! Don't shoot!
Get down!
Capcom also seemed to have cut Leon's backstory as to why he isn't with the rest of the police force for his first day. According to the 1998 game's official guidebook, Leon's girlfriend broke up with him, which made him drunk at a party and overslept, waking up in the afternoon the day after, which coincidentally is his first day of being a cop in Raccoon City. There was no mention of this in the remake. Instead, they made Leon just stay at his home on standby and just decided to drive to Raccoon City because he felt that something was off. Enemy variants have significantly been reduced in the remake. Out of all the 22 enemy variants present in the original game, only 14 of them is available. However, the remake seems to have only gotten rid of enemies that have been seen in the original game for only once or twice and add nothing else than being just another hurdle for the player or just plain nuisance. Such examples of this instance are the giant moth, its larvae, large roaches, giant spiders, and the zombie crows. I personally would have liked it more if they retained these enemies as they further add to the context of just how transmittable the virus is, but at the same time I'm glad they didn't because the game would feel even more cramped than it already is and some of them wouldn't make sense story-wise. Just take the crows for example. What's stopping them from leaving Raccoon City and infecting nearby areas? But that's just my opinion. The ivy plants from the original game has seen changes instead of being removed entirely. When before there were just literal plants that could walk with their vines, ivies in the remake are now a special type of zombie that don't die until you burn them to a crisp, thus preventing them from regenerating the orange pulses in their body that keep them alive. The evolved leaker in the original game is also nowhere to be found in the remake. However, the normal leakers here are already lethal and dangerous, capable of killing you within 2 hits or less, eliminating the need for a special variant. The remaining enemies are more or less the same in both games with just slight changes in either their backstory for the special enemies or how tanky they are and their significance to the game. For example, the regular zombies scattered throughout Raccoon City are the same in both games, but the zombies in the remake are faster and much more resilient. The adult G-type found in the sewers are now regular enemies and can be avoided if you choose to, unlike in the original game where it is a mandatory boss fight. The RP dimension has seen some overhauls as well, especially its third floor being expanded compared to the original games. However, the layout of the area should still be the same and will be familiar to people that have already played the original. Some of the puzzles have changed and some of them even moved to the other areas. Weapons that you can find are pretty much the same for both games, though there are some minor changes in omitted weapons like Claire's bowgun and the normal grenade rounds for the grenade launcher. The major change Capcom did in the remake, however, is the addition of sub-weapons, which we will be tackling later in the gameplay section. Overall, as I've mentioned earlier, the remake is really faithful to the original game. There are some major changes between the original game and the remake, but they aren't big leaps that will destroy the already established canon of the game that basically changed the game's whole story. The remake pretty much plays out like the 1998 game but with modern graphics and gameplay. Resident Evil 2 Remake is one of the most gorgeous games I've played when it comes to its graphics. Now I know that there are a lot of strong opinions regarding photorealism in video games, but I for one is a sucker for them. If you don't like that kind of thing in video games, I can totally respect it. Raccoon City is looking better than ever. It was definitely an upgrade from the original game. Well, at least the portion that we can explore. Using the RE engine means the game can now have lighting effects that weren't possible before due to the hardware limitations of the PS1, so Capcom made sure to utilize this new technology to provide the spooky and tense atmosphere that the remake has. It's also a way for Capcom to hide enemies from players for some jump scares, since in the original game, they could just hide enemies out of the player's view because of the fixed camera angle. But now that the game uses an over-the-shoulder perspective, hiding enemies in obscure places won't work quite as well. Obviously, the enemies in the remake have gone some visual changes as well, making them look more detailed than in the original game, which means that they're more grotesque and terrifying, but at the same time can help you better in identifying their moves. The Leaker's detailed model, for example, now shows its exposed brain in higher detail, but it also shows you its lack of eyes. The remake also has amazing sound design that helps you build tension and alarm you of incoming threats. You will mostly rely on the sound to know in advance if there are enemies in your path, as well as let you know if you need to run away, since the game uses a binaural audio design that can tell you the exact location of the sounds you're hearing with almost pinpoint accuracy. This will come in handy even more once you meet the stalker enemy of the game, as you will need to avoid him at all costs and plan the routes that you will be taking. Most of the time, the game only plays diegetic ambient noises in the background as you explore the city, which adds even more tension to the game. Even when they add music to scripted events, the music still gives you this urge to hurry the hell up, and it just fits perfectly well with the game's motif. Sound design for enemies are also really terrifying and works both as a tension builder and a jump scare. I won't be calling it a cheap jump scare because that's how the enemies generally sound. It's not just a one-time thing that makes you jump out of a chair. It plays around the idea of players being very cautious about their surroundings and being very tense about it, and the game just needs to make a diegetic noise, in this case enemy screeches and screams, and it becomes a very effective scare. And I can't believe how optimized this game is. Resident Evil 2 Remake is a 2019 game with gorgeous photorealistic graphics, but my almost a decade-old computer could run it butter smooth in custom medium settings, which is closer to high graphics settings at 60 FPS and 1080p. It occasionally drops down to 45 to 40 FPS in certain places, and very rarely get frame freezes. I got like 3 or 4 of them in the entirety of the time I've been playing this game, but it runs at 60 FPS for the majority of the time. It's unbelievable, and I love the game even more because of that. I will be posting the specs of my computer down in the description for those who are curious, so you can have some references onto what system build I'm playing this game, and I purposely left the Steam's FPS counter at the top right for further frame reference. though it's a bit small to see as to not become a distraction in the video. Overall, Resident Evil 2 Remake is visually pleasing to look at and is a genius in utilizing sound and its lighting. The fact that my computer can run it with no problems in medium settings really shows that it's optimized enough to be run by computers with parts from at least 5 years ago, and it's just really fantastic, especially for people who do not have the budget to buy high-end systems. Its visuals and soundtrack also complement its interesting story.
Oh, I believe you, buddy. I believe you. Just tell us a story. Tell us a story.
Okay, well, it was last Friday night. I was walking home from the bar, and this woman started coming towards me. She was staggering, so I figured she was drunk.
The Resident Evil franchise is one of the most convoluted lore when it comes to video games. The main plot of each games are pretty straightforward, but the little nuances and tidbits of backstory that you can find throughout the games are so massive, it will take you days to understand any of it and establish their connections with one another. To make things simpler, we're just going to talk about this game's story. The game begins with an oil tanker driver listening to his radio while driving down a dark road in a rainy night. As he fixes his radio when it started to spew out static, he hits a woman standing in the middle of the road. As he panics on what to do after checking the woman's dead body, said corpse stood up and the screen goes black. We will now be introduced to the two protagonists, Leon Kennedy and Claire Redfield. You can choose between two scenarios, Leon first run and Claire second run, and Claire first run and Leon second run. This is reminiscent of the original game scenarios as well, namely Leon A, Claire B for the first disc, and Claire A, Leon B for the second disc. The second run, or the B section in the original game's case, lets you play as the character you didn't choose, showing the path that they've gone to during the time you've been playing as the other character. I have some complaints about this, but we'll leave it later in the video. Anyways, if you chose to play as Leon first, you will see him driving to Raccoon City to find out what's going on after not getting contacted by his superiors in his first day of being a cop. Along the way, he stops by at the gas station to refill his car's fuel, only to find out the horrifying monsters inside the station shop. After running back out to the entrance, he meets Claire Redfield, and together they escape the gas station, now sprawling with a horde of zombies, and went up towards Raccoon City. If you choose to play as Claire first, you will see her driving her motorbike while giving the exposition as to why she's going to Raccoon City, to find his brother Chris Redfield, who is a cop. She was talking to someone using a telephone booth in the gas station and was about to scoot away when she heard a noise inside the station shop. This scene pretty much plays out similarly with Leon's, although now Claire's the one inside the shop. The next scene will play out the same regardless of who you chose to play as. The two finally reach Raccoon City only to find out that it is also sprawling with zombies as well. The two were supposed to stay together if not for the oil tanker we've seen earlier, now its driver succumbing to the zombie virus, ramming their car and separating them. Their plan now is to meet each other inside the police station so they can continue to do their objectives together. But of course, we all know that's not going to happen. Along the way, you will pick up notes linking this zombie outbreak to the Umbrella Corporation, a pharmaceutical company inside Raccoon City. Claire also finds out sooner that Chris isn't in the city and is on some vacation in Europe, so now her only objective really is to escape the city. Meanwhile, Leon wants to know the truth about the zombie outbreak, dedicated to put the mastermind behind the bars. Either way, both of our protagonists will eventually find themselves inside the Umbrella Corporation building. While there are two different scenarios, the flow of the story is pretty much the same. Your chosen character will arrive inside the Raccoon City Police Department mansion turned station, solve some puzzles and collect some firearms, meet briefly with the other character only to get separated again because of zombies, get out of the RPD mansion and team up with new characters, play as said characters for a brief while before returning to the main character, and finally learn about the origin of the zombie outbreak and escape the dreaded Raccoon City. Throughout the game, you will find some tidbits of lore and world building through the notes and computer terminals, hinting at the origins of the zombie outbreak as mentioned earlier, and how the police department is involved in it and whatnot. There will also be hints for you to read through regarding on how to deal with certain enemies or how to manage your inventory spaces, because trust me, if you haven't had to deal with inventory spaces before in a video game, you will learn how to in this game. Gameplay has seen a huge improvement in the remake over the original game, replacing the fixed camera perspective with an over-the-shoulder camera angle that makes you connect more with the character that you're playing as and let you experience firsthand the horrors of the zombies and other monstrous creatures that you will be encountering throughout the game. Going through doors now doesn't show you a slow animation of opening them, but instead your character will just go through them if you're running, or seamlessly open it themselves by pushing it if you're in normal walking speed. Using items on certain objects is now more intuitive, showing you your inventory as you examine the object that you're interacting with. Combining and opening key items will now also show a brief animation, which is a pretty nice addition. Health is still represented with a vital signs monitor and split into 3 stages: green fine, orange caution, and red danger. Getting hit by enemies usually decreases their health from green fine to orange caution, and healing is still also done with green herbs and first aid sprays. Shooting enemies has also changed as well because of the perspective change. You can now freely aim your weapon and hit enemies wherever you like. However, the generic zombies in the game are much sturdier compared to the original game to compensate for your ability to free aim, and similar to the original game, you still can't kill enemies with one bullet even if you're aiming directly at their head. The zombies' health also depends on what difficulty you are playing on. Resident Evil 2 Remake has 3 available difficulty settings: Assisted, Standard, and Hardcore mode. These difficulties change how much health enemies have, so unfortunately, headshots in the game doesn't necessarily kill zombies in one hit. Blowing the zombies' heads are RNG based as far as I've read on the internet, similar to how it worked in the original game. And there are no guarantees on when it will happen except when using certain weapons. It's so different to what Leon himself made you believe in that one CGI movie.
The infectees' brains.
Destroy their brains?
Shoot them in the head.
Standard mode is the base difficulty of the remake, balanced between quality of life and the need to be thrifty in supplies as to not run out of them. It's basically the vanilla experience of the original game, but tweaked to suit modern standards. It's pretty much the recommended difficulty to play on for your first time, especially if you are new to the franchise. Assisted mode is something that I don't really recommend anyone to use. Playing in this mode turns the game from being a horrifying survival horror game to a generic third-person shooter with a blend of horror. This mode offers an aim assist that you can't turn off, and your health regenerates when you don't get hit for a few seconds. Worrying about your character's health and running out of healing items are 2 of the core components of Resident Evil's horror, and this mode just removes that entirely. Enemies are also weaker and can die within a few hits, almost completely removing them from the list of threats that can harm you and significantly lowering the risk of running out of ammo. You can basically run past enemies without killing them, since it won't matter if you get hit, as you can just regenerate your health as you run. Hardcore mode, on the other hand, makes enemies much more resilient than they already are in standard mode, as well as making them hit harder. This mode also brings back the ink ribbon mechanic that was present in the PS1 trilogy. For those of you who don't know, saving your game in the first 3 Resident Evil games requires you to use an item called the ink ribbon. This is to operate the typewriter that your characters use to write some logs to save the game. Standard mode in the remake removed that need, but they put it back in hardcore, which makes saving a decision to make as well, since there are only a number of ink ribbons available, and they also take up a space in your inventory. The limited amount of inventory space that made people scratch their heads as to what to discard to make room for key items in the original game can be found here in the remake as well. You can upgrade the inventory spaces in the original game only once, giving 2 additional spaces, and will actually make it so it's unavailable for the other character in the B section if you take it on the A section. In the remake, however, you can upgrade the character's inventory spaces up to 6 times for a total of 20 inventory spaces, and can be done in both runs for both characters. Every item that you pick up in the game aside from notes will be put in your inventory. Some items take 1 inventory space while others take 2. Ammo for your firearms also take up space, essentially making firearms take up 2 spaces, some of them 3 because the firearm itself already costs 2 spaces. You can also put these firearms into shortcut keys, eliminating the need to equip them through a menu and allowing you to switch to them on the fly. Key items can't be discarded, although the game will tell you if they have exhausted their use. If they did, the game will now allow you to discard them, freeing up space in your inventory. One of the more notable mechanics in both the original and this remake is the combine system, which lets you combine the items that you have. In the original game, reloading preemptively requires you to combine the appropriate ammo with its respective firearm in the item menu. You cannot make your character reload during gameplay unless the magazine is completely empty. In the remake, there is now a dedicated button to reload, so combining your ammo with its respective firearms is not necessary. However, combining key items, gunpowder to get more ammo and special ammo, and the renowned herbs is still present. Inventory management doesn't only mean that you need to take care of your inventory spaces. It also means you need to conserve ammunitions and healing items, because Raccoon City ain't just gonna give you bullets for your firearms and green herbs to heal yourself willy-nilly. I even almost got soft locked near the end of Leon's first run because I just barely had enough ammo and damaging items to kill the final boss. Missing more than 3 shots from my weak-ass pistol or not aiming at its weak point means that I won't be able to take it down. And the fact that I don't have any healing items means I could only get hit twice by the boss or I had to restart the whole fight. The fight was fairly easy, the lack of supplies is what made it harder than it's supposed to. Careful inventory management is key to make sure that you are efficient with the scarce supply that you can gather from the city. After all, aside from your firearms, the other enemy damaging items that take up slots in your inventory are your sub-weapons. Sub-weapons are a new addition to the remake. Remember that flimsy knife that you can get in the original game that serves no other purpose than to make new players take unnecessary damage because the knife is a useless weapon and they didn't know any better? It has tremendous use now in the remake. Knives are now part of the sub-weapon category together with the newly added frag grenades and flash grenades. You can also equip the sub-weapons independently from your main firearms and you can use them on the fly as well. Knives still do almost no damage at all, but they are now serve a higher purpose. They can prevent you from taking damage when a zombie gets a hold of you, which is a tremendous lifesaver and will save you a green herb or two. Knives degrade upon use, so you need to pick up another one if they break. You also need to retrieve your knife from zombies after stabbing them. You can also use a knife to poke dead bodies to make sure that they're not actually enemies, or poke zombies that you have already shot in the head to make sure that they are absolutely dead. If not and they're just pretending to be, the knife can be used to kill them, or at least deal enough damage so that you can shoot them dead for sure with just a bullet or two, saving you ammo. Frag grenades and flash grenades are much more powerful, however. Frag grenades are pretty self-explanatory, but they can kill zombies in just one explosion if they are close enough in a blast. And the blast range is quite hefty as well, making it quite easy to land perfectly tossed grenades into groups of enemies, instantly killing them and saving you tons of ammo. And obviously, frag grenades are quite useful in boss fights. Flash grenades on the other hand can stun enemies and lets you take a breather in the middle of a fight or if you just want to get past an area quickly. It also disables leakers very effectively, which makes flash grenades a really handy tool if you have a lot of leakers that you don't want to confront as you pass by an area. It also works well on bosses to give you that extra time to put more bullets into them without worrying about their attacks. Both of these grenades can also be used to prevent zombies from dealing damage to you, working similarly with the knife, although of course with the frag grenade you can instantly kill the zombie where you shove the grenade in and damage any nearby enemies. But while both Leon and Claire can pick up the same sub-weapons, their main arsenal vastly differs. While there are no major differences between Leon and Claire when it comes to the scenario's story flow, the weapons they get are so different. Specifically, Claire gets all the good stuff while Leon seems to be stuck with standard weapons like shotguns and pistols. Claire not only gets a grenade launcher very early in the game that removes leakers as a threat, she also gets a powerful stun gun and a minigun at the end of the game. She gets weapons for pretty much every situation. To balance this, her starting handgun is quite weaker compared to Leon's, can only hold up to 5 bullets, and takes a million years to reload until you get one of its upgrades that shorten its reload time. She cannot craft high caliber bullets, and the ones that you pick up from various areas are essentially the only high caliber bullets you can have as Claire, compared to Leon where he can pretty much craft it with gunpowder. Speaking of Leon, he gets 2 pieces of handguns as well, a shotgun, a flamethrower, and an anti-tank rocket launcher at the end of the game, which he will only use twice. These are comparatively pretty underwhelming. The flamethrower is nice, don't get me wrong, it's what I use to defeat one of the final bosses of the game and killing Ivies becomes a trivial matter with it, but I still think Claire has the better assortment of weapons. However, other than weapons and changes to plot points, there really isn't any other differences between the two scenarios, which is a bit of a problem that I will be tackling more later in the video. Overall, Resident Evil 2 Remake's gameplay is a fantastic modernization of the original game. It changed quite a lot of gameplay elements but did so in a way that still retains the overall feeling of the 1998 game, all the while making it fresh and digestible for newcomers to the series and has absolutely met modern standards. Its new difficulty settings make it quite an experience for hardcore veterans of the franchise to further challenge themselves and relive the true experience the original game has when it comes to limited saves and lack of checkpoints, while being more accessible for newcomers to the franchise and people that are not really into video games but want to experience the story and horror that Resident Evil 2 Remake has to offer. There were some things that I really didn't like about the game, though this may be really subjective and it won't affect how much you will enjoy the game. While the first and second run are so much different from each other, it does the thing I hate about video games where it will let you play as the other character and show you what they are doing during the time you've been playing as the other one, but once you reach the areas that you've already played through as the other character, all puzzles will be undone and locked doors will still be locked. This really breaks the continuity that they're trying to accomplish, and Resident Evil 2 Remake does this as well, and I just don't like it. Some instances of this are these doors with the spade symbol on them. This is like the very first suit doors that Leon can unlock during the first run with the spade key, but once you start the second run as Claire and come across these doors, it will still be locked and you will still need to find the spade key again to unlock it. It just doesn't make sense. I know that this is meant to prevent players from breezing through the second run, but I wish they implemented different puzzles and locked doors instead. Keys shouldn't take up slot in your inventory. It adds challenge, sure, and I actually enjoy managing my stuff as to not run out of spaces just in case I need to pick up these keys, and that's how they did it in the original game after all, but in my opinion, it doesn't make sense. It does emulate the old games, but I think making these keys not take up inventory space would be such a nice addition to the game. Other key items like say the T-shaped bar or the gear wheel should be okay to take up inventory spaces because it makes sense. They're just objects. It still doesn't make sense how they can fit all those in their hip pouches, but it's much more understandable. But keys? Nah fam, I don't think so. This is purely subjective and I'm pretty sure there are a lot of people will go against this problem of mine, and it's okay. I understand because again, like I said, I enjoyed the inventory management together with these keys. I just don't see how logical it is for them to take inventory spaces when the game could have just offered players key rings or whatever to store these keys in away from their inventory spaces. Playing a different scenario feels repetitive. There are no changes between Leon and Claire's first runs except for plot points that will separate their stories, which is right after skipping the RPG mansion and the weapons that they get, but other than those, almost everything is still the same. Taking my experience for example, I have just finished Leon's first run and Claire's second run, so most of the locker combinations and puzzle solutions are more or less still fresh in my mind when I started Claire's first run. That fact alone made the RP dimension pretty much trivial, and I didn't have to look for locker combinations for the majority of them, because they didn't change. I also know most of the enemy placements already, so they're pretty much easy to avoid, and I already know which enemies to actually kill or avoid, essentially saving me tons of ammo in the RP dimension segment. Meanwhile, the section after escaping the RP dimension is also the same as Claire's second run. The only change is that the key item placements and puzzle solutions are now similar to Leon's first run, like the chest pieces to open the door in the sewers, and Leon's second run is the same as the segment of the RP dimension during Leon's first run, but with key item placements and puzzle solutions similar to Claire's second run, and some differences in the events regarding the ending. I am fully aware that this is by design since these two scenarios are alternate canons, although Claire's first run and Leon's second run is the official canon scenario and is supported by the events in Resident Evil 6, and that this is also what happened in the original game, but it just doesn't click with me. Overall though, these problems of mine are really nitpicky things and they're not huge enough to ruin one's experience. Resident Evil 2 Remake is a fantastic reimagination of the 1998 game. It's a fine balance between the novelty of being a modern era video game and familiarity to the original game. Veterans and newcomers alike will be able to pick this game up, and people with a fairly old computer will be able to run this game with how optimized the game is. It's a gorgeous looking game that takes advantage of its new game engine to create even better scares and build up wonderful tensions throughout the game, and it's just a joy to play through. Its gameplay is a huge step up from the original game, giving players more freedom when it comes to movement and gives the ability to pre-aim weapons. It has some problems regarding its repetitive nature and the lack of continuity between the two characters, but it is overall a really fantastic remake and Capcom couldn't have done better. Once again, I totally recommend it to everyone regardless if you're new to the franchise or not. It is an absolutely fantastic game.